Welcome to your deep dive. Today we're tackling something that, I think it impacts all of us,
Yeah.
whether we really think about it or not.
Right.
And that is nationalism.
Hmm.
We're going to be looking at a really influential book
Okay.
called Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson.
Yeah. A classic.
It's considered like
For sure.
one of the most important books on this topic.
Yeah.
And, you've given us a ton of great additional sources to kind of unpack alongside this book.
It's a lot to think about.
It is a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So Anderson's big idea is that nations are basically imagined communities.
Right.
They're not built on those direct, face-to-face connections that we think of with families or
Right.
villages,
Yeah.
but they're based on these shared beliefs
Yeah.
and symbols and stories that kind of create this feeling of belonging.
Totally.
So we're going to explore that imagined aspect
Okay.
and how something as seemingly simple as newspapers help to kind of solidify these national identities.
Yeah. I think what's so fascinating is how Anderson, really makes that connection between the rise of, print capitalism in Europe and how that really kind of gave birth to the idea of nationalism.
Right.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Before we had mass-produced books and newspapers,
Right.
ideas just spread way slower.
Yeah.
But then suddenly everyone's reading the same news, the
Yeah.
same novels at basically the same time.
It's almost like everyone's on the same page, literally.
Literally.
Literally, yeah.
Which creates that sense of unity, that just wasn't possible before.
Yeah, exactly.
But how does this imagined community then differ from, say, the sense of community you feel in a small village?
Well, I think in
Yeah.
a village,
Yeah.
everyone, you're
Mhm.
interacting face to face. You rely on each other,
Mhm.
nations, especially as they get larger.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible for that to work.
Yeah.
You can't possibly know every single person in your nation. Right.
But newspapers and novels,
Yeah.
they help to create this sense of a shared experience.
Yeah.
This mental image of being connected to something much bigger than yourself.
So it's more about a shared narrative,
I think so.
a feeling of,
Yeah.
Belonging to a larger story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think one of the coolest things that Anderson points out is
Okay.
how important newspapers were
Yeah.
in shaping this narrative.
Okay.
Because they come out every day.
Yeah.
They're covering things from all over the place.
Uh-huh.
So it creates this sense that the world is in motion.
Yeah.
That we're all experiencing this shared timeline together.
And that really comes through in some of the examples you sent.
Okay.
Like in Reisel's Noli Me Tangere,
Right.
where you have characters all over Manila
Right.
reading about the same dinner party.
Yeah.
It really highlights
It does.
how print media could foster this sense of a shared experience, even across these huge distances.
Yeah. And Anderson even talks about
Yeah.
the Indonesian novel Samurai Hitam, the main character.
Yeah.
He's just referred to as
Right.
our young man.
Right.
And it instantly makes him relatable to every Indonesian reader.
Yeah. It's subtle,
Totally.
but it's so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. It reinforces that sense of
Yeah.
we're all in this together.
Right.
We're all part of the same us.
It makes you wonder how people even thought about belonging to a nation before these mass forms of media.
I know, right? It's crazy.
But then how did this imagined community phenomenon spread to places that were being colonized?
Well, that's the crazy part.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of ways, the colonizers were trying to impose their own national identities.
Right.
But that's almost where the irony lies.
Yeah.
And how a lot of these colonial powers ended up falling apart
Okay.
because they gave the colonized people the tools to imagine themselves as separate nations.
It's like they handed them the blueprint for their own liberation.
Exactly. And this wasn't lost on the people being colonized.
Right.
Like we see with Suwardi Surjaningrat.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Japanese nationalist.
Okay.
And he basically called out the Dutch
Yeah.
for celebrating their own independence on colonized land.
Oh, wow.
He's like, how can you
Yeah.
celebrate freedom when you're denying it to us?
That must have been a powerful statement
Yeah.
to make at the time.
Yeah.
It shows how the colonized people really started to see the hypocrisy
For sure.
and use those tools against the colonizers.
Exactly.
Yeah, and education played a huge role in this too.
Totally.
The systems set up by colonizers to, teach European history, to
Right.
teach the idea of the nation state,
Right.
it kind of backfired
Oh, for sure.
because it
Sorry.
inspired the colonized to think about their own independent nations.
Yeah. It's almost like they
Mhm.
planted the seeds of their own
Mhm.
destruction.
But once these ideas of nationalism started spreading, it wasn't just about like resisting colonial powers, right?
Yeah.
You started to see ruling elites and dynasties using it for their own purposes.
Oh, yeah. This is what Anderson calls like
Okay.
official nationalism,
Right.
where the state promotes a very specific vision
Right.
of the nation,
Okay.
often to bolster their own authority.
So it's not just about uniting people, it's about
Yeah.
control too.
A lot of times.
Right. Okay.
And, this often led to a lot of inequality,
Yeah.
with some groups, getting favored,
Right.
while others were pushed to the margins or even persecuted.
Right.
And you see this in what
Yeah.
you sent me about Siam,
Okay.
modern-day Thailand,
Yeah.
where the king,
Yeah.
who was actually educated in England,
Okay.
he adopts this nationalist stance
Right.
that targets the Chinese immigrant population,
Oh, wow.
even though
Yeah.
his own father had encouraged them to immigrate there in the first place.
That's such a
Wow.
striking example of how, this concept of nationalism, once it took hold,
Yeah.
could be manipulated and adapted to fit all these different agendas.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
And it raises these questions about like the relationship between patriotism and racism,
Yeah,
which Anderson also talks about.
he does. And it's
Yeah.
a really important,
Yeah.
though often uncomfortable
Right.
aspect to look at.
Yeah.
Colonial structures kind of created this
Yeah.
aristocratic racism among Europeans.
Okay.
This feeling that they were just naturally superior
Mm-hmm.
to the people they were colonizing.
Yeah.
And they used these racist ideologies
All right.
to justify everything they were doing.
So their whole idea of their nation was built on this foundation of racial hierarchy.
Sadly.
Yeah. It's a
Tough.
tough
Yeah.
thing to think about.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that this type of racism, like,
Yeah.
it wasn't usually mirrored in these anti-colonial movements.
Right.
There are some instances of prejudice,
Sure.
but the early nationalist movements were much more focused on like self-determination, not asserting racial dominance.
Right.
So this idea of like reverse racism, it wasn't really a defining feature
It doesn't seem like it.
of those struggles.
No.
That's interesting. It was more about reclaiming their own history
Right.
and culture,
Mm-hmm.
their right to govern themselves,
Exactly.
which makes the lasting legacy of colonialism
Yeah.
on modern national identities,
Right.
particularly in Southeast Asia,
Okay.
even more complicated.
Totally. Yeah. Because
Yeah.
Anderson points out how things like census categories
Mm-hmm.
and maps,
Right.
even archaeological practices
Mhm.
that were established during colonial rule
Uh-huh.
are still shaping how those nations see themselves.
It's like the ghost of colonialism is still there,
Yeah, it lingers.
like in Malaysia,
Yeah.
where the census still has these racial categories
Right.
from British colonial times.
It's crazy.
That's wild.
And then they use those colonial era maps
Right.
to justify territorial claims.
Yeah.
Even though
Yeah.
those maps were often drawn
Right.
with no regard for existing cultural or ethnic boundaries.
Right. Right.
It really shows how the past is still shaping the present
Yeah.
in these subtle but powerful ways.
It's almost as if these like technical details, map censuses, they become part of this like shared imagination of the nation, even though they're rooted in these really problematic origins.
That's a great point.
It speaks to how Anderson's idea of imagined communities,
Yeah.
it's not just some theory.
No.
It's about understanding how something
Yeah.
as simple as a line on a map
Yeah.
can become so deeply embedded in
Sure.
people's sense of belonging, of who
Especially
they are as a nation.
It's powerful stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of what we consider national identity is based on
Yeah.
these constructed realities.
That's a great question.
But let's take a quick pause
Okay.
to gather our thoughts
Okay.
before we dive even deeper into this.
Right.
Okay, so we've been talking about how these imagined communities get shaped,
Right.
but it's also interesting to think about how, like, the rise of the nation kind of coincided
Yeah.
with the decline of other ways that people identified themselves.
Totally.
Like, what did people feel loyal to
Yeah.
before the concept of the nation took hold?
Well, that's a great question.
Yes.
And Anderson actually talks about that.
Okay.
He says that the rise of national consciousness really went hand in hand
Okay.
with the decline of like religious communities
Okay.
and those big dynastic realms ruled by kings and emperors.
So the nation kind of became this new focal point.
It did.
The new community that people felt connected to.
Sure.
But how did that happen? Was it just like a matter of time, or were there like specific factors that drove this shift?
I think Anderson points to a few key things. First, you have the rise of print capitalism and the spread of like vernacular languages.
Right.
As more and more people became literate in their own languages, rather than just Latin, the language of the ruling class, it helped to create this sense of shared identity that cut across those older lines.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like having a common language created this new imagined community.
Exactly.
One that wasn't bound by those like older, more rigid hierarchies.
Right. And this was all happening
at
the same time that religious authority was declining.
Right.
You know, more secular ideologies were gaining ground. People were looking for new sources of meaning and belonging.
Right.
In a lot of ways, the nation state, with its promise of, unity and progress, kind of filled that void.
So it's like the nation became the new religion.
Now, I think, in a way.
Offering that sense of purpose and belonging in a world that was getting more and more uncertain.
For sure. And Anderson's analysis really helps us to see how something that feels so modern, like the nation, is actually rooted in these much larger transformations.
It's not just like a product of the 19th or 20th century.
Exactly.
Like the culmination of centuries of change.
Exactly.
It's making me rethink my whole understanding of history.
I know.
It's not just about dates and battles. It's about how people's sense of belonging has shifted and evolved.
And that's so important for how we approach nationalism today, because it helps us to get beyond these really simplistic ideas of good versus bad nationalism.
Right.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. And the source material goes into some of those complexities.
It does.
Like how colonial powers, while trying to impose their own national identities, they often ended up like co-opting or manipulating existing traditions.
Yeah, like they weren't starting from scratch.
Right.
They were building on existing power structure and cultural narratives to solidify their control.
And a perfect example of that is how colonial powers in Southeast Asia used archaeology to like legitimize their rule.
It's like they were digging up the past to justify their presence.
Right.
They would focus on these grand monuments and empires to create this narrative of like historical depth and continuity.
Like, look, we're not just some random foreign power. We're part of your history.
Yeah, we've been here all along.
But of course, it was a carefully curated history that served their interests.
They were definitely leaving some stuff out.
Right. They ignored or downplayed the histories of ordinary people, the stories that didn't fit their grand narrative.
Exactly.
And the really interesting thing is that this process, like, it had this lasting impact.
It did.
Even after independence, a lot of Southeast Asian nations kind of continued to embrace these colonial era narratives of national identity.
I mean, the monuments, the museums, the historical sites that were established during colonial rule, they all became part of the national landscape.
Right.
They shaped how people imagined their past, their present, even their future as a nation.
It's a really powerful reminder that history isn't objective.
No.
It's always being interpreted, rewritten, used to serve different agendas.
And that brings us right back to Anderson's main point, that nations are ultimately imagined communities constructed through shared narrative, symbols, experiences.
And even though they're imagined, those narratives have very real consequences.
They shape our laws, our institutions, our relationships with other nations. They can inspire great acts of courage and sacrifice. But they can also be used to justify horrible atrocities.
That's why it's so important
I agree.
to critically examine these narratives, to ask questions about like where they come from, who they benefit, what stories they might be silencing.
Yeah, and to remember that these imagined communities, they're not static. They're always evolving, being reshaped by new forces and ideas.
Speaking of new forces, Anderson's book focuses a lot on print media. But how do you think the rise of the internet and globalization
that's a great question.
is impacting these imagined communities today?
Oh, I think Anderson would have been fascinated by that.
Yeah.
It's clear that the internet and globalization are like changing how we experience national belonging.
On the one hand, they can connect to people across borders.
Right.
Expose us to different cultures and perspectives. But on the other hand, they can also like fuel these nationalistic sentiments as people retreat into like familiar identities when faced with all this rapid change and uncertainty.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And I think it makes Anderson's work even more relevant today as we're trying to figure out this increasingly complex world.
It's like we need a new way of imagining communities, one that acknowledges both our shared humanity and the richness of our diversity.
Yeah, one thing that struck me in the source material, and maybe something that Anderson doesn't emphasize enough, is like the emotional power of nationalism.
Yeah.
It's not just about ideas. It's about these deep-seated feelings of belonging, loyalty, even love for your nation.
It's like that feeling you get when your national team scores a winning goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you hear your national anthem played at like some big event.
Totally.
It can be really powerful.
Oh, for sure.
And it's not just individual emotions either.
Yeah, it's collective.
Right.
Like there are all these rituals and symbols that reinforce those feelings.
Right, like national holidays, flags, anthems.
Yeah, exactly.
They all tap into this shared sense of identity.
And it's interesting how those things can be both like spontaneous and orchestrated.
Yeah, like on one hand, you have these organic expressions of patriotism, but then you also have governments and institutions using them to promote a very specific vision of the nation.
And that's where things can get complicated because that emotional power, it can be manipulated.
It can be used to unite people, but it can also be used to divide them.
Absolutely.
Which brings us back to that complex relationship between patriotism and racism.
Yeah, because while patriotism at its core is about love for your homeland.
Right.
That love, it can get twisted into something ugly.
Right. It can lead to a sense of superiority.
Totally.
To hostility towards people who are perceived as different or as threats to the nation.
Exactly. And sadly, we're still seeing that all over the world today.
Right. Nationalism often goes hand in hand with xenophobia and discrimination against minority groups.
It's a constant reminder that even though the nation is an imagined community, the consequences of how we imagine it can be very real.
So how do we move forward then?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Like how do we harness the positive potential of nationalism without falling into those traps of exclusion and prejudice?
I think it starts with being aware of the complexities, you know, the potential for both good and bad.
Right.
We need to be critical of the narratives that we're being told and be willing to imagine new, more inclusive words of belonging.
It's like we need to find a way to celebrate our differences while still recognizing our shared humanity.
And even though Anderson focuses on the past, I think his work gives us some really valuable tools for thinking about the future of nationalism.
It reminds us that nations aren't these like fixed entities.
They're not set in stone.
Right. They're constantly being shaped and reshaped.
By the stories we tell, by the symbols we embrace, by the choices we make.
And that ultimately the future of nationalism is up to us.
I think so.
Okay, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how like the nation kind of became almost a replacement for religion.
Okay.
It's such an interesting idea.
It is.
And it makes me think about like the psychology of it all.
Yeah.
What is it about the nation that like fulfills this deep human need for meaning and belonging?
That's a great question. And I think it gets at why nationalism has been so powerful throughout history.
Yeah.
I think part of it has to do with the stories that nations tell about themselves.
Yeah.
These stories about like shared origins, common values, this idea of a collective destiny. They give us a way to understand who we are or where we fit in the bigger picture.
It's almost like the nation becomes a character in this larger story.
Totally.
And we as citizens, like we become part of that narrative.
Exactly. And those stories often tap into really primal emotions. Pride, loyalty, this sense of purpose.
Right. It's not just about being part of a group.
No.
It's about being part of something.
It's about being part of something bigger.
Yeah, bigger than yourself.
Yeah, something that transcends your individual life.
And that sense of transcendence can be so powerful.
It is.
Especially in times of like crisis or uncertainty.
For sure.
It's like people are looking for something to hold on to, something to believe in.
To believe in.
And the nation often provides that.
It often does.
But that's why it's so important to think about how those narratives are constructed.
Sure.
Who's controlling them.
Exactly.
What agendas they might be serving.
Because that power could be used for good or for evil.
It's like that old saying, the pen is mightier than the sword.
Totally.
The way we imagine our nations, the stories we tell about ourselves, they can have a huge impact on the real world.
And I think that's where Anderson's work is so valuable. It gives us a framework for really examining those narratives.
Right.
For understanding how they're shaped and for questioning their assumptions.
Because the nation is ultimately an imagined community. And that imagination is something we can all participate in.
It's not fixed. It's not predetermined. It's constantly being...
negotiated.
Right, renegotiated.
Yeah.
And that gives me hope.
Me too.
Because it means we have the power to change those narratives, to create more inclusive and equitable visions of what our nation's
a challenge. It is a challenge. But it's also an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. We have this chance to kind of write the next chapter in the story of nationalism.
I love that.
To imagine communities that are more compassionate. And more truly representative of all people.
Exactly. And to do that, we have to be willing to have these tough conversations, to really engage with different perspectives, and to listen to the voices that are so often marginalized.
Right, or silenced.
Exactly. It's not easy.
It's not easy, but
it's so important.
It's essential.
And I think that's what Anderson's work ultimately calls us to do.
I think so.
To think critically.
Yeah.
To imagine creatively.
To imagine creatively.
And to act courageously.
Yes.
In pursuit of a better future.
For everyone.
For everyone.
Wow.
This has been great.
This has been amazing.
Yeah.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface
me too.
Of this, like...
It's such a
complex and fascinating topic.
Huge topic.
But I have a much deeper understanding...
I'm glad.
...of how nations are imagined.
Yeah.
And why it matters so much.
It's so important.
Oh, thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
It's been great talking with you.
Diving into this with you.
And to everyone listening.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for being here.
On this journey. I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. And given you some new perspectives to think about.
Yeah. Because the nation is ultimately a story we tell ourselves.
It is.
What kind of story will you choose to tell?